Look at a person's hands during a mortar strike, and you'll learn everything about how they're going to die. Some people clench, some try to catch the falling plaster. Ruth Becker just held the IV bag higher. We thought she was terrified. We were dangerously wrong. Forward station. Echo 4 wasn't a medical facility. It was a purgatory built out of corrugated tin damp pine and rotting sandbags. The rain didn't fall here so much as it gave up hanging in the air like a cold, greasy solvent that got into the threads of your socks and stayed there until your skin went white and peeled off in the night. Corporal Roy Cleary sat on cot 4 with 22 fresh staples in his left thigh and a stolen paper cup of lukewarm chicory coffee. He was 26 going on 45. Across from him sat Ruth, Nurse Becker. She had those pale, slightly watery hazel eyes of someone who hadn't looked at a horizon in 6 months. She was currently trying to thread a curved suture needle, her fingertips vibrating like a plucked cello string. Tink! The needle slipped, bouncing off the scrap of green linoleum they used as a sterile tray. Ruth didn't curse. She didn't sigh. She just made a small, wet sound in the back of her throat, picked it up with her forceps, and dropped it into the red biohazard tin. That was the 3rd needle she'd contaminated in 10 minutes. Roy watched her over the rim of his cup, feeling a dull, patronizing ache of pity. If the valley goes orange tonight, he thought, I'm going to have to carry her, and my leg is going to split right down to the femur. Leave it, Becker, Roy said. His voice sounded like gravel being kicked down a tin chute. The kid's out cold. The skin'll hold till the morning bird gets here. The edges aren't approximated, she said. You always had to lean in an inch to hear, Ruth. She spoke at the exact volume of a library checkout clerk. If the margin puckers, it traps the ambient flora. She whispered, her eyes fixed strictly on the pale, iodine-stained calf of Private Glover, a 19-year-old who had lost 3 toes to a wet ditch and was currently floating somewhere over the Atlantic on a majestic cloud of liquid demerol. You know what the damp does to an open margin, Corporal? Yeah, it makes it smell like my first marriage. Put the steel down, Ruth. You're giving me the shakes just watching you. She didn't put it down. She took a breath so massive her sharp little collarbones pushed against the cheap green cotton of her scrubs, grabbed a fresh needle, and tried again. This time, the silk caught. She tied the knot with clumsy, hyper-deliberate little jerks, her pale tongue poking out the corner of her mouth like a second grader doing long division. It was 02:15. Out back, the diesel generator gave its standard 2-stroke hiccup, chunk whine chunk, and settled back into its greasy, rattling hum. Then the Motorola did the thing. Usually the radio sat on the folding table spitting out the low, rhythmic click-fuzz of the valley repeaters. It was the heartbeat of the sector. As long as the squelch kept clearing, it meant the kids up on Ridge 9 were still drinking their terrible powdered tea and keeping their thumbs off the transmit buttons. At 02:18 the squelch didn't clear. It died. Not a slow fade into static, but a hard, solid digital clack, followed by the absolute dead-weight vacuum of an open, unmodulated frequency. Roy's coffee cup stopped 3 inches from his lower lip. His right heel, the good one, dug instantly into the dirt floor beneath the cot. Becker, he said, I have to log the promethazine. She muttered, her back turning to him as she reached for a damp ledger. The count was off by 2 ampules on the shift change. Shut up, put the pen down. She froze. Her shoulders hitched up toward her ears, the classic hard-wired prey response. It drove Roy insane. Look at her, he thought. One loud noise and her spirit is going to leave her body through her teeth. Roy swung his bad leg off the cot. The skin around the 22 staples went taut, sending a hot, bright wire of pure warning up into his hip, but he ignored it. He reached between the mattresses and pulled out his M9. The bluing was worn down to bare silver steel along the slide from 3 years of riding against his pelvic bone. He hopped twice heavily to the reinforced plastic window. Outside, the valley was a smudge of wet charcoal. Then the trip flare on the north berm popped. It didn't make a sound. It just bloomed a sudden vicious magnesium-white dawn that turned the scrub oaks into skeletal hands and threw the long, distorted, jagged shadows of the sandbags right against the station wall. No crack of an M4 followed it. No panicked 20-year-old voice screaming over the net. Just the white light sizzling in the wet sedge, burning itself down to a red cinder in 12 seconds. The dark came back down like a dropped stage curtain. "Oh," Ruth said from the desk. It wasn't a scream. It was the small, disappointed sound someone makes when they drop a carton of milk on the driveway. "Get your kit." Roy whispered, his thumb slicking the Beretta's safety up into the red. "Get behind the autoclave, right now." The layout of Fob Echo 4 was an architect's bad joke. It was a single 70-foot concrete hallway, the spine, with 4 rooms budding off it like swollen polyps, the ward, the pharmacy lockup, the scrub closet, and the dead-end utility nook where the massive industrial steam autoclave sat. The front double doors led out to the mud pit of the motor pool. The back emergency exit was currently padlocked from the inside because the frame had warped during the October shelling. They were sitting at the bottom of a concrete test tube. Roy dragged his bad leg across the floor, his boot heel leaving a long, dark snail trail of mud and spilled iodine. He caught Ruth by the meat of her forearm. Her skin felt like a package of ground beef that had been sitting in a fridge door. "Listen to me." He hissed right into her temple. He could smell the wintergreen gum she kept in her cheek to stave off the formaldehyde nausea. Whoever just crossed that wire didn't trip the flare to say hello. If they were regulars, they'd be putting 60 rounds of 7.62 through this tin siding right now just to see what jiggled. They're silent. That means they're clearing. Ruth's eyes didn't track to his face. They stayed bolted to the muzzle of the Beretta. Her pupils were so wide, the hazel looked like a thin, dying ring of moss around a black hole. "The boy," she whispered, her chin trembling as she pointed at cot 1. "Glover stays," Roy rasped. "In the dark, a kid under 2 blankets looks like a sack of laundry. We stand up in the open, we collect the copper. Get into the nook." He practically shoved her behind the massive, double-walled steel belly of the sterilization tank. It was the only object in the building denser than an engine block. He reached behind his spine, unclipped his backup, a stubby 5-shot .38 Smith & Wesson he'd bought off a drunk warrant officer in Kuwait, and shoved the rubber grip into her palm. "5," he said. "Heavy double action. You have to mean it when you pull it. Don't look for a sight picture. Point it at the center of the biggest mass of black you see and keep squeezing until the cylinder clicks empty. Do you hear me, Becca?" Ruth looked down at the little revolver. Her fingers didn't wrap around it. They sort of hovered over the frame like she was being asked to hold a wet bird. "Roy!" she whispered. Her voice was shaking so violently the syllables were bumping into each other. The line pressure. Forget the damn charts, Ruth held the gun. He pivoted back towards the double doors of the ward, his bad leg giving a wet internal thrum of agony as he dropped his weight onto his right knee behind an overturned wooden crate of saline bags. His heart was doing a high, stupid fluttering rhythm right in the center of his throat. This was the trashiest way a man could cash out wearing standard-issue waffle thermals, bleeding through a staple job, dying over 6 boxes of generic amoxicillin. The sound came 4 seconds later. It was the deadbolt on the motor pool doors sliding back. Not kicked, not blown with a strip of C4. Slid. Someone had the master key off the belt of the duty sergeant outside. The heavy exterior hinges let out a tiny high-pitched scree of dry iron. Roy leveled the Beretta at the door frame, both hands locking so hard his front sight was shivering. A shadow detached itself from the pitch-black corridor. It didn't walk. It flowed. It had that horrible, low-slung, oily posture of a man who had spent 4,000 hours practicing how to put his heel down without making the floorboards talk. A dual-tube night vision rig sat over the face like the blunt, blind snout of a deep-sea crab. The weapon tucked into its shoulder was short, thick, and wrapped in dull burlap. Roy didn't yell. Halt. You don't give a ghost a multiple-choice question. He pulled the trigger twice. Crack, crack. The yellow strobe of the 9mm lit the room for a microsecond. In that flash, Roy saw the point man's chin snap up as the first round caught the lower edge of his ballistic mask, sending a spray of black plastic and red mist into the doorframe. But the guy didn't drop. His armor absorbed the second round with the sound of a baseball hitting a heavy leather sofa, and the man's finger simply closed down on his own trigger in a dying reflex. Pat, pat, pat. The suppressed submachine gun sounded like someone aggressively beating a wet rug with a broom handle. The wooden crate in front of Roy turned into a high-velocity cloud of pine toothpicks and warm salt water as the saline bags ruptured. Something hot, blunt, and invisible caught Roy right below the left collarbone. It didn't feel like a puncture. It felt like being hit at 30 miles an hour by a swung bowling ball. The sky went entirely gray. His heels left the linoleum, his back slamming into the base of the folding table, so hard the metal legs buckled, bringing the Ledger the chicory coffee and the red Sharps tin down on top of him in a clattering avalanche. The Beretta skittered away into the dark, spinning wildly on its side. Through the high ringing whistle in his ears, through the warm, sweet taste of copper instantly flooding the back of his tongue, Roy saw the boots. 2 more pairs of them. They stepped over the twitching body of their point man, moving into the ward with a sickening, unhurried cadence. 2 green laser modules began to paint the dark, cutting through the floating dust of the shattered drywall, like long, glowing needles searching the corners. Roy couldn't find his lungs. He tried to draw air, but his chest just made a wet, rattling hiss like a punctured tire. His vision was turning into a narrow, dark tunnel, the edges curling in like burning paper. Shoot! He thought, his brain screaming the command at the dark corner of the room. Pull the trigger, Ruth. Just make a loud enough bang that the picket 3 miles down the road calls the artillery. He rolled his head an inch to the left, looking through the gap in the steel legs of the autoclave stand. Ruth Becker hadn't raised the .38. She had laid it down on the stainless steel prep tray. It was sitting right next to the tongue depressors. Instead, her small, pale, trembling hands were wrapped around the brass regulator valve of a 5-foot-tall dark green cylinder of industrial-grade E nitrous oxide. Her chin wasn't tucked into her collar anymore. Her eyes weren't wide. They were narrowed to 2 tiny, glittering wet slits, fixed with an absolute, terrifying, sociopathic intensity on the digital readout of the room's central HVAC wall sensor. She wasn't looking at the men with the guns. She was looking at the room like an equation. And tucked under her left armpit was a 30-inch solid cast iron pipe wrench with the teeth filed down to the raw silver. The sound of the snapped valve wasn't a hiss. It was a shriek. High-pressure gas escaping a sheared brass neck hits 120 decibels if you take the dampener off. It sounds like a semi-truck locking its air brakes inside a concrete drainage ditch. The 2 operators pivoted instantly. Their green laser modules stopped their rhythmic sweeping of the baseboards and snapped toward the nook in a double parallel strike. "Contact, right!" The trailman grunted. His voice was a flat, unbothered baritone picked up by Roy's ringing ears. They didn't fire immediately. Professional shooters don't dump magazines into a sound. They check their corners. That 3-second hesitation was the exact mathematical window Ruth Becker had budgeted for. What the operators didn't know about forward operating base Echo 4 was that it had 0 cross-ventilation. The Army, in its infinite logistical wisdom regarding winter heating conservation, had ordered the combat engineers to seal the corrugated eaves with expanding polyurethane foam back in November. The HVAC unit on the roof wasn't drawing fresh mountain air. It was a closed-loop recirculator. Ruth reached up her knuckles white and slammed the red toggle switch for the central scrub exhaust to off. The room stopped breathing. Nitrous oxide is 1.5 times heavier than atmospheric air. It doesn't rise to the rafters. It pours. It rolls over the floorboards like an invisible freezing tide of sweet-smelling mercury, seeking the lowest point in the topography. Roy felt it first. Lying on his side, his cheek pressed against a cooling puddle of his own dark blood, the air suddenly tasted like artificial vanilla and cold iron. His lungs, already laboring against the growing vacuum of his collapsed left pleura, tried to pull it in. Instantly, the sharp, bright, screaming edges of his gunshot wound grew a thick, heavy layer of wool over themselves. His brain did a slow, lazy somersault inside his skull. No, Roy's dying consciousness sparked a sudden cold spike of pure horror, cutting through the euphoria. She's putting the whole room under. The point man took 2 low, measured steps towards the nook, his boots crunching over the broken glass of the saline vials. He raised the suppressed muzzle of his weapon, his finger taking up the slack in the trigger. Behind the steel tank, Ruth reached up with both hands and grabbed the manual cast-iron emergency purge lever of the Amsco Eagle 3000 autoclave. She threw her entire 88 pounds of body weight backward. The unit had been running its deep tissue sterilization cycle for 40 minutes. Inside its double-walled titanium jacket sat 60 gallons of distilled water superheated to 270 degrees, held in check by a single heavily greased neoprene door gasket. When the seal cracked, it didn't sound like a machine. It sounded like a breaching humpback whale. A solid horizontal pillar of opaque, roaring white steam exploded out of the utility nook at 80 pounds per square inch. It struck the lead operator directly in the center of his chest. The physics of modern ballistic armor are designed to arrest high-velocity lead. They are fundamentally incapable of negotiating with the laws of thermodynamics. The superheated vapor passed instantly through the porous nylon webbing of his plate carrier, penetrated his moisture-wicking combat shirt, and turned the layer of sweat on his own skin into boiling water. The man didn't scream. You cannot draw a breath to scream when the ambient air entering your pharynx is hot enough to instantly blister your soft palate. He let out a high, reedy whistling, waffle his hands flying toward his throat. Simultaneously, the dual-tube night vision goggles strapped to his helmet met the high-density water vapor. The sensitive image intensifiers designed to multiply ambient starlight by 10,000 caught the blinding white-hot thermal reflection of the steam cloud and instantly overloaded. The operator's vision turned into twin searing green screens of pure, screaming static. He ripped the helmet off his head. Hurling it into the fog, his eyes squeezed shut against the scalding mist. He was blind, his skin was sloughing off his sternum, and from the knees down his boots were submerged in an invisible lake of heavy, sweet-tasting anesthetic. Out of the white wall of the fog, the 30-inch iron pipe wrench came horizontally. It was moving at the speed of a swung cricket bat. It didn't hit his head. Ruth wasn't tall enough to clear his shoulder pads, and she didn't try. The raw, filed-down silver teeth of the wrench caught him laterally across the left knee, the exact unprotected anatomical juncture where the fibula meets the tibial plateau. Crack. It was the dry, definitive sound of a hickory axe handle snapping over a knee. The operator's left leg ceased to be a load-bearing structure. He went down hard, his heavy ceramic plates dragging him sideways into the freezing layer of nitrous pooling on the green linoleum. Before his shoulder even struck the deck, the flat, blunt back of the wrench's upper jaw came down vertically like a standard-issue tent mallet. It struck the side of his neck right where the trapezius meets the base of the occipital bone. The man's body went instantly shockingly limp, his heels drumming out a brief 5-second tattoo against the floorboards before going entirely still. The second operator didn't freeze. Years of high-intensity room clearing took over the driver's seat of his nervous system. He couldn't see his partner was down, and the ward had turned into a roaring 200-degree terrarium. He dropped his center of gravity into a deep squat, leveled his weapon at waist height, and held down the trigger in a sweeping 180-degree horizontal arc. The drywall behind the folding table turned into a blizzard of pulverized gypsum. One of the heavy 9mm slugs struck the iron frame of Private Glover's cot. The sleeping teenager let out a soft, dreamy sigh as the mattress shifted 3 inches to the left, completely oblivious to the fact that his chin had just missed a high-velocity copper jacket by the width of a postage stamp. The submachine gun clicked empty. The bolt locked rearward with a hollow metallic tink. The operator's hand dropped instantly to his belt, his thumb catching the base pad of a fresh 30-round magazine. Clackslide, he listened. In a standard intensive care unit, you learn the shuffle. You never lift your heels when carrying a tray of full urine beakers or an open rack of glass ampules in the dark. You keep your soles glued to the wax, so you never trip over an ungrounded telemetry lead. Through the dense, swirling soup of the steam, the operator heard the wet shh of a rubber sole sliding across spilled chicory coffee. He pivoted toward the sound, raising the fresh magazine to the mag well. He didn't realize she was already inside his elbows. Ruth hadn't approached from the open floor. She had dropped onto her stomach, crawled under the low aluminum frame of Cot 2, like a mechanic sliding on a creeper under a Buick, and stood up directly behind his right triceps. The operator felt the sudden displacement of the steam behind him and threw a vicious blind backhand with the heavy steel frame of the submachine gun. Ruth didn't try to block the steel. She let her knees give out entirely, dropping her weight straight down into the void. The heavy stock sailed 3 inches over her hairnet. As she fell, both of her small, pale hands shot upward, her fingers locking with a desperate, white-knuckled death grip onto the man's heavy nylon rigger's belt. She used his own violent rotational momentum against him. She planted the heel of her nursing shoe directly behind his Achilles tendon and jerked his belt straight down toward the linoleum. The 220-pound soldier went airborne for a fraction of a second. His boots lost their purchase on the wet linoleum, and he came down flat on his back. The impact hit the floorboard so hard the iodine bottles on the overhead shelf rattled in their wire cages. The air left his lungs in a massive, concussive "hoo!" He reached up blindly with his left gloved hand, his fingers catching the thin green cotton of her scrub top, ripping it straight down the seam to the shoulder. Ruth didn't pull back. She didn't try to protect her modesty. She dropped both of her knees straight down onto his floating ribs, driving every ounce of her 88 pounds into his diaphragm, and brought the silver teeth of the wrench down onto the bridge of his nose. Once, twice. The third time, the heavy cast iron didn't make a striking sound. It made a heavy wet thud against the subfloor beneath him. The roaring of the autoclave finally died, choking itself out in a series of wet, rhythmic hiss gurgles as the water reservoir ran completely dry. Overhead, the emergency backup lighting kicked on a sickly, pale amber strobe that pulsed through the thinning, warm fog like a dying turn signal. The valley outside was completely silent again. Roy lay on his back, his vision swimming in a strange, beautiful pastel-tinted haze. His chest felt like an old steamer trunk filled with wet wool, but the absolute paralyzing terror of the last 4 minutes had been replaced by a profound, floating indifference. A pair of small, white orthopedic nursing shoes stepped into his field of view. The left shoelace was broken and tied back together with a tiny, clumsy square knot. Ruth knelt beside him. Her scrub top was torn open to the armpit, exposing a pale, sharp shoulder covered in a faint dusting of freckles. Her mousy brown hair had escaped its net, plastered across her forehead in wet, dark streaks, and her left cheek was smeared with a long, bright, drying smear of someone else's type O negative. She looked down at him. Her pale hazel eyes were completely back to normal, slightly watery, entirely unheroic, and fixed with an intense, judgmental squint on his bleeding chest. Her hands were shaking so violently that the little silver Kelly forceps she was holding were clicking together like cheap castanets. "Corporal Cleary," she whispered. Her voice was right back to that infuriating, quiet library clerk register. Roy tried to say holy shit, but only a small pink bubble popped on his lower lip. "Your pleural margin is compromised," she muttered. Her fingers fumbled with a square package of Asherman chest seals, peeling the thick plastic backing off with her incisors. Her chin was trembling so hard she almost dropped the dressing, but she slapped the sticky central valve down over the sucking red hole below his collarbone with brutal, practiced force. The one-way rubber flutter valve let out a tiny, high-pitched pfft as his trapped lung finally pushed a pocket of stale air out into the room. Roy took a massive, shuddering, agonizing drag of real oxygen. The nitrous fog cleared from his prefrontal cortex, just enough for him to roll his head 2 inches to the left. The 2 men in the dark, tactical gear were piled against the baseboards like discarded duffel bags. Sitting neatly on the stainless steel prep tray resting right between the tongue depressors and the red biohazard tin was the 30-inch iron pipe wrench. It had been wiped completely clean with a green, sterile huck towel. "Becca," Roy croaked. His voice sounded like old newspaper being crumpled in a fist. Where the hell did you—" "The state penitentiary in Altoona," she whispered, her eyes never leaving the adhesive border of his chest seal as she worked the wrinkles out of the plastic with her pale, hyper-deliberate little thumbs. 7 years on the night shift in the secure psychiatric annex. You don't raise your voice to the ones who come in quiet, Corporal. It overstimulates them." She reached into her untorn pocket, pulled out a fresh, slightly crushed stick of wintergreen gum, unwrapped it with her vibrating fingers, and tucked it into her cheek. "Now hold still," she whispered, picking her curved needle back up off the tray. "Your margins are a mess. They say the hardest thing to survive in a war zone isn't the shrapnel, it's the people you underestimated. If Ruth's story gave you chills, do us a quick favor, hit that like button, drop a comment below, telling us what you would have done in that autoclave nook, and subscribe to the channel."